Going for Growth. This session is about regulating the peace, how regulatory reform can boost our growth and recovery. I'm Chris Giles, I'm the economics editor of the Financial Times, and I can't really think of a more important topic for the UK and the UK economy in particular. In macroeconomics, we normally think about two things in general. One is the cycle. We talk about the ups and downs, the swings of the recovery, and the booms and busts, and we're doing a hell of a lot of that at the moment with the coronavirus crisis. But more important in the long run, as everyone has said, Paul Krugman and everyone else, is productivity. What is the trend growth, the underlying growth of the economy? What are the underlying trends that will ultimately shape prosperity, living standards for everyone in the country? And that's what this session is going to be focused on, the latter. How do we make overall, notwithstanding the ups and downs of the economy we're going to have, how do we make ourselves a more prosperous and more successful society? And if we just look back at the past decade, we've got to admit that it's been a very, very bad decade. In fact, the worst decade in many centuries that we've had in the UK. Productivity growth, normally we used to think it was a regular number that would never change. It would be 2% a year on average. Productivity growth would just go up by that, and therefore that's what living standards roughly would rise by. But since 2008 onwards, in the 12 years after that, it's been 0.2%. So we've lost 90% essentially of our productivity growth. It's not been constant. There have been better years and worse years, but that's the overall average over the decade we've seen. And so although we had quite a lot of growth in the 2010s, that all came from either working harder or more people working. And that was obviously a very good thing, to have many more people in jobs and working harder, but it didn't come from efficiency. And we can't keep on adding people to the labour market because we don't have enough people there. So what we need to change for the decade ahead is we need to get efficiency back and productivity growth back. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. And just to make things more difficult, I'm going to lay out 4 challenges which are going to make this actually even harder than what we might have thought we had in the past decade. Because there's 3 aspects of the economy and society in Britain we have in the decade ahead, which actually will probably weigh on productivity growth rather than boost it. And I think this is by common consensus, these things are probably going to hurt rather than help. Not all the panel will necessarily agree with that, but I'm talking about the consensus here, not necessarily who we've got speaking today. One is the move towards net zero and environment. While that might be absolutely necessary for long-term survival of the planet, it's probably going to make productivity growth more difficult. The second, of course, is Brexit. We're going to be leaving. We already have left the EU, and everyone in the economics world, or nearly everyone in the economics world, thinks that is likely to harm productivity rather than help it, because putting up barriers to your main trading partner is not necessarily the way that is likely to improve your growth rate. And the third, of course, we know now is a new thing from 2020, is the coronavirus crisis. And while that might have only transitory effects, is likely to make things more difficult because certain aspects of normal economic life are likely no longer to be viable in the long term, for example, and that means there'll be stranded capital, and transitions are generally painful for growth in the long term. And apart from those things, we also have probably fewer inputs or labour inputs because we have an ageing population. So the backdrop to this discussion is very difficult, and I can't think, therefore, of a more important time to be thinking about it and coming up with bright ideas to improve it, because we need them. And so I'm very pleased to be welcoming on the panel, to be joined by Kate Andrews, the economics editor of The Spectator, Philip Boo, a fellow at the rival think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, Luke Ellis, the chief exec of Man Group, the hedge fund manager, and Tom Clougherty, the head of tax at the CPS itself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let all 4 people have 5 minutes or so each to just give out their thoughts about how to use regulation as a way of boosting growth, and then we'll have a discussion. But remember, at the end of this, there'll be at least 10 minutes for questions from the audience, and you can submit questions to us either in the YouTube chat box or by tweeting at CPS Think Tank. And now I'm going to let Tom Clougherty from the CPS itself start and have the floor first. Tom.
All right, yeah, thank you very much, Chris. one of the key themes of our work at the Centre for Policy Studies, obviously the theme of today's conference, is that growth isn't just something that happens to governments. It's something that policymakers can influence in a positive way or in a negative way. And I do think that over the years we've lacked an understanding of that point. We've sort of taken growth or the lack of it for granted, and we haven't really grasped the nettle. I think it's going to be, absolutely essential, given all of those headwinds, Chris, that you just mentioned, that we do have a proper, robust, well thought through growth policy going forward. And I talked about there being certain levers that policymakers can pull. One of those is regulation, right? I mean, the government has taxing powers, it has spending powers, and then it has regulatory powers. And so to have a growth strategy without regulation being a key part of that, well, it's not much of a growth strategy at all. However, regulation is a really tricky area. If it was easy, one of the 10 or 11 previous regulatory reform strategies that have happened while I've been in Westminster would have worked, and maybe we wouldn't be talking about this anymore. So why, first of all, is regulation such a tricky area? I think there's a couple of factors. First of all, you're really running to stand still. Simply stopping the regulatory state from growing and spreading further is almost a full-time job in certain positions in government. And so to really make strides in the opposite direction, whether that's rolling back the frontiers of the regulatory state or making regulation better and more supportive of competition and growth, this is tough stuff. It takes an enormous amount of concerted effort on the part of politicians and officials. And of course, they've got many competing priorities. I understand why, after all, it's not the sexiest issue in the world either, why this often falls into the background and regulation just keeps rolling on. Secondly, I think when we look at regulation, we actually operate with a bit of an information deficit. There's an awful lot about regulation and growth that we really don't know, that we don't fully understand. And I think we do a reasonably good job in this country of sort of estimating the impact that new regulations are going to have on existing businesses and feeding that into the policy process. There are flaws with the way we do it, of course, but at least we're trying. However, there is far less attention paid to the existing stock of regulation. For example, I think DEFRA is the only government department that has actually audited its entire sort of regulatory stock, all the things that they're responsible for. That's a process that really needs to take place across government. But it's not just the stock of regulations, but their cumulative effect. I think that when you talk about regulation, almost any individual regulation, unless it's completely crazy, is going to sound quite reasonable. And quite positive, just in isolation. But the cumulative effect, there's a sort of straw that breaks the camel's back approach. And I think it's regulation layered on regulation, layered on regulation that really may have the most significant impact on growth. That's something we don't fully understand yet. And I think the other thing is that there's just this great unknowable with regulation, because the biggest cost of bad regulation isn't anything to do with existing businesses, really. It's the businesses that never get off the ground. It's the ideas that never come to fruition because they were blocked at some early stage. That's kind of unknowable, but that's the really important thing with regulation. So what do we know? Well, I think it's very clear that land use regulation, the planning system, has a hugely negative effect on growth in this country, and we need massive liberalisation. I think that's probably the single biggest thing that the government could do to boost growth in this country. And, the devil will be in the detail, but things seem to be moving in an encouraging direction. We also know that flexible labour markets are incredibly important from a growth perspective. And we have quite flexible labour markets in Britain. I think the government's committed to not, declining on any existing standards, but I think we do want to make sure we maintain that flexibility, and also perhaps that we look on developments in the labour market, like the gig economy and so on, as positives that aid the function of the free market, and not as problems always that have to be solved somehow. What else? You look at regulatory impact assessments, and we've looked at a few at the CPS over the last few months. It's fairly obvious that some of the most costly regulations are on things like climate change and the environment, and also on financial services. Now, we're committed to this net zero thing. I don't think the government's going to row back from that at all. The thing I would say there, though, is, do you need a lot of regulation? Is regulation the best way to achieve those goals? In general, I'd say that having clear price signals, maybe something like a comprehensive carbon tax is a better and more effective way of supporting growth than a regulatory solution to environmental problems. Finance, I know Philip probably will talk about finance, he's more expert in this area than I am, but it's a hugely important sector of the British economy. It's hard to see where we're going to get really good growth numbers from without the city thriving. And I think it's also the case that since the financial crisis, we've seen falling productivity in financial services, in large part due to new regulation. So nobody wants another financial crisis or anything, of course. But we need to think about what's absolutely necessary and what's effective in financial regulation and side the way the rest. I could go on about specific areas, but I'm running out of time and I don't want to bore everybody. But I'll just finish by making one broader point, which is that, from time to time, policymakers will come to us and say, which regulations, which particular things should we get rid of to encourage growth? And I love that mindset. That's very encouraging. But I also think it's why previous attempts at regulation have failed. We've had no end of one in, 2 out, 1 in, 3 out, red tape challenges and so on, asking businesses to suggest which regulations they want to get rid of. These things are all welcome, but they haven't seemed to be very successful in the past. And that's because I think that you just get bogged down in the detail of this regulation, that regulation. You get overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what you're dealing with and the constant onslaught of new regulatory imperatives. And it's very hard to win that battle. And so I think really, if you want to make regulatory policy much more supportive of economic growth, you need a change of mindset in government. There's a great theory sort of from the academic literature that we've gone from having a fiscal activist state that owns things and runs things to having a regulatory state today, one that tries to control the financial sector and control the private sector and encourage businesses to deliver on social and environmental objectives. Maybe we need to move beyond the regulatory state. We need to think of a different way of doing things. Policymakers, when there's a problem, don't reach for that ball of red tape. Think about ways to boost competition. Think about ways to empower consumers more. Because I think if we stay with the same mindset, we will work so hard just to stay where we are, and the impact on growth, maybe outside a few important areas like planning liberalisation, it won't be much to write home about. So that's really a change of mindset. I think is the biggest change, the most important thing that we could do to make regulation more pro-growth.
Thank you very much, Tom. And given your role as the head of tax, I will come back to you and ask you later on about what sort of tax changes could help, not in terms of the overall level of tax, but in terms of changing the way the tax system works to improve the regulatory or reduce the regulatory costs of the tax system itself. So I'll just give you fair warning there. Okay. That is something that is coming down the track. Kate, why don't you have a go at answering the big question first of all? What would you like to see in regulation to improve the growth rate?
Thanks, Chris. Well, I thought I'd start by giving a little context as to where I think the government and the public might be at when it comes to regulation. Generally speaking, especially around the Brexit debates over the past few years, you can really put people into very clear camps, whether they're talking about regulating more or keeping regulatory standards within the EU or moving to deregulate. And oftentimes deregulation is a bit of a bad word. It's a scary word. It's just assumed that you want to lower workers' rights, you want to lower our standards when it comes to environmentalism and the rest. I'm not sure that's completely gone. I have no doubt with Brexit back in the news that we'll be having those debates again, but I do think something has shifted in the past 6 months. At the peak of the virus, when we had the most amount of deaths in hospital, we also, of course, we know now, and I think you pretty much could have known at the time because you weren't allowed to go get a cup of coffee, you weren't allowed to go sit in a pub or restaurant. We also had a record high peak of the virus in terms of deaths and a record contraction of the shrinking of the UK economy. And in order to try to mitigate that as much as we possibly could when it was necessary to be shut down, rules became the norm. Rules around COVID, what parks you could or could not sit in, where you could or could not go. But so did the rollback of certain kinds of regulation. And this happened on different kinds of scales. I think on the very individualistic level, something that you might have experienced when you were in lockdown is that your local restaurant or pub all of a sudden became a takeaway, and you were able to take food away where they would deliver right to you. Rules around drinking around pubs and areas were more or less ignored when pubs started doing takeaway pints, and nobody really complained about that. Putting out chairs and tables became very popular. Al fresco dining, as they do in mainland Europe. Yes, I do understand that there are forms that you have to fill out, costs that are associated with this, but actually a lot of places just started doing it, and you didn't get those complaints. And then I think you sort of have that mid-tier of rollback and regulation, the suspension of wrongful trading provisions to get more resources into the country, even around things like broadband. And then you have those pinnacle regulations, the regulations that if people had said, even a year ago, you're going to touch those, people would have thought you were absolutely insane. Fast tracking PPE supplies, producing and distributing certain kinds of equipment or hand sanitizer, sometimes within a matter of days. I mean, if you had said that car manufacturers should be able to produce ventilators on the side, or that a gin company should be able to make hand sanitizer that's going to be used around the UK, a lot of people would have said, this is crazy, this is dangerous. But actually, at the height of the crisis, we were applauding these companies for getting around the traditional regulatory barriers and being able to do this. And I think perhaps the most obvious example is the fast tracking of a vaccine. The entire world is coming together to overstep certain kinds of regulation to get a vaccine for COVID-19 as soon as possible. And I think, you know, whilst there will be people who are nervous about this, and the politics around a vaccine is a totally important and different conversation to have itself, I think the vast majority of people are hopeful and think that if you do get the world working together on this, if people are from, you know, across the scientific community coming together, fast tracking is probably okay. They're going to make sure it's safe. You don't necessarily have to have adhered to every single regulation on the way to make sure that at some point in the future we can take doses of that vaccine. So I suppose I paint this context because I think it's a good time to start talking about how we deregulate or roll back certain kinds of regulation, not with some philosophical attitude that it's always the right thing to do, but if we are going to recover from this COVID crisis, if the economy is in any meaningful way going to get back on track in the next 2 to 3 years, if we're going to have that chance at a V-shaped recovery, then we're going to have to allow businesses and entrepreneurs and their employees to take slightly more risk to get the reward. Now, the government isn't really talking about supply side reforms. Tom mentioned planning, and I think that's a really important one to flag up because so far it is the only real supply side reform that we've seen come out of government. The holiday for stamp duty, they are trying to build more homes and liberalize the planning system. I agree with Tom that we need to take that much, much further. In many ways, it's the obvious low-hanging fruit, perhaps not politically in certain seats, but without a doubt, if you properly liberalize the planning system, make it easier to move, make it easier to buy, make it easier to go and do the work where people want to do it. And we're seeing big changes in attitude around the country as to where people want to work post-COVID. You have to liberalize the planning system. You have to liberalize the green belt. I think that's an obvious one. In terms of some other areas where, Chris, you mentioned the recovery from COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 making productivity gains, making recovery so much harder. In terms of other areas where I think it's opened up the conversation is around childcare regulation as well. And the fact that people have been without it, haven't been allowed to use it, have been encouraged to return to work, but don't have the childcare to do it. The fact that a lot of part-time workers, especially in areas like retail, may well be set to lose their jobs very sadly in coming months, or certainly have their hours rolled back. For many couples, one person's job is just about paying for the childcare. It's extremely expensive, some of the highest costs in the OECD. Perhaps this is the time that we start talking about that child-to-child minder ratio that countries like Denmark seem to get right and have their cost of childcare significantly lower. And Chris, you also mentioned the net zero target, and to piggyback a bit on Tom as well, no doubt that it's the environmental regulation on top of regulation which has brought costs up. A report that I was part of in press releasing when I was still at the Institute of Economic Affairs suggested that electricity charges for households in England and Wales had increased by over 50% in real terms since 2001, whereas the decade prior had actually seen a significant decrease. And the major difference was the regulations that were coming in that were proving very costly. Now, that's not to say that we can't prioritize this, we must, but I agree with Tom that something like a carbon tax or a proper cap and trade scheme is probably better than just throwing the regulation book at this issue and actually not achieving our end goal. We still don't have that energy white paper, and it's not obvious at all that even if you kept every environmental regulation on the book that we'd come anywhere close to achieving net zero by 2050. So it's not obviously the answer. I suppose I'll just conclude with a little bit of warning. One of the briefings to come out recently is that this government is seriously considering boosting its state aid, and they want to do that because they want to get more business into the UK. They want the tech companies to come to the UK. They want trillion-pound businesses in the UK. And this is the Brexit sticking point that Chris mentioned as well. And if you're going to take that protectionist perspective, and that's the kind of Brexit that you're going to pursue, then I have no doubt that that is going to harm productivity and growth in the medium term. I think there are other forms of Brexit that wouldn't necessarily do that, and certainly in the medium term could really improve those things in the UK. But if the focus continues to be that planning is that supply side reform, that regulatory reform that we can bring in, and everything else is going to have a more protectionist angle, then unfortunately I think the recovery from COVID, our pathway to net zero, our Brexit, and all of it is going to prove extremely problematic, I think, for your average worker who is going to struggle to see their wages go up. It's been a bad decade for that. Who's going to struggle to see where those new jobs are after COVID, and so many are going to be lost. So a lot of it is about the framing of these issues and how they're going to help in the post-COVID recovery. Not always what government can step in and do, but certainly how they can help facilitate better regulatory environments in which businesses can operate. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I think you make a very valid and important point when you're looking at the COVID crisis to say, if anyone wants to say whether regulations are important or what's evidence for the importance of regulations for economic performance, all you have to do is look at the February to April period where we introduced lots of regulations called a lockdown, and we lost 25% of our economy. So I think that that is more evidence than you could ever say that this is a very important topic. And Philip, why don't you say a few words just to introduce us?
Okay, thank you. And I agree with everything really that Kate and Tom have said. So I'm going to take just a slightly different perspective rather than either repeat that or disagree with them. Now, it seems strange to start a talk on the economics of regulation by mentioning that I'm a Christian, but I will. And as a Christian, I believe that human beings can tell the difference between right and wrong. They can reason, and they can, to use a modern phrase, think outside the box. Other animals can't do that. And I think the growth in regulation has reached such a point that it's dehumanizing in a very literal way. It prevents people from exercising ethical judgment, from using reason to subjectively manage situations, and it prevents us from using our human ingenuity to innovate. My dog can tick boxes. When I say sit, he sits. If I go into the room and get his lead and click it, he rushes to the living room door and starts wagging his tail. But if I say to my dog, you can decide how many sausages you want to eat today, he can't reason and decide to limit his intake, balancing his need for energy, for his enjoyment of sausages, and bearing in mind how obese he might get. I have to weigh his food out for him, but I don't need Public Health England to weigh out my food for me. Now, I'm starting here rather than with economic arguments, because I don't think we realize the extent to which our lives have been overtaken by a culture of compliance to regulatory codes. And when I say culture, I think it is a culture. It goes way beyond government. It pervades the whole corporate sector, and I think an awful lot of it is actually self-imposed, with the corporate sector going beyond what is required by government. There are whole engine rooms designing regulation and codes of compliance in every significant sized organization in society today. Now, to take one example, most universities, and remember universities in the United Kingdom, unlike in many countries, are private institutions, not state institutions, are now going through a process called the Research Excellence Framework. And this is a system whereby there is bureaucratic assessment of the quality of research in 150 different institutions across 34 different subject areas. The amount of staff time that goes into this is enormous. But then in addition, whole work plans, indeed whole careers of academic staff are distorted by this exercise. And then it's overlaid by diversity and inclusion agenda, so that about 1/3 of the code of practice that universities write, which themselves are about 150 pages long, to convince Research England about that they are going through this process fairly, is a diversity inclusion assessment and a statement about how diversity inclusion criteria are met. It's a system designed to kill creativity and to reward adherence to processes, just like my dog gets rewarded for adherence to process. And the growth of regulation in the financial sector, which is well documented since 1986 in particular, is very well documented. Essentially, a machine for writing rules has been created, and unrestrained, it's very effective at doing that. So in 2011 alone, it's very difficult to get these figures, but and 2011 is the only year I've seen figures like this for. The UK financial regulator introduced regulation or issued guidance, advice, discussion documents, or consultations totaling 4.3 million words. That's 5 times the length of the Bible. And this output included a 585-page consultation document on the regulation of the mortgage market, which then led to a 312-page document of regulations on the sale of mortgages. Now, it's worth remembering that there was no statutory regulation of mortgages at all until 2004. It was just simply regulated by contract law and general consumer regulation. And yet we probably have the most efficient mortgage sector in Europe in terms of the margin between borrowing and lending rates in our banking sector. Not only that, mortgages had never caused a serious bank failure, and customer defaults on mortgages were very rare. Regulation has become ubiquitous, and it's extremely damaging. And there are a number of ways in which it's very damaging. First of all, clever people are employed to write regulation rather than doing useful things. This is the explicit or overt cost of regulation. And that's both in government, but also, as I say, in this wider culture of regulation in corporations with CSR departments, HR departments, and so on. Secondly, there's an explicit cost of compliance for companies, charities, and other organizations. And this is likely to be a multiple of the explicit cost of regulation. Thirdly, regulation prohibits profitable economic activity and requires things to be done in inefficient ways. This includes direct prohibition on businesses entering markets with new business models, Uber being a very good example there. But also, I think, potentially increasingly important, given the state of the labour market post-COVID, things like minimum wage laws, which don't seem to have caused much damage in the UK so far, but may well cause a lot of damage going forwards over the next 3 or 4 years as the economy tries to recover from COVID. And in that environment, the government is increasing minimum wages significantly. Fourthly, I think there's a cost which is impossible to measure from a culture of compliance replacing a culture of creativity. And then finally, because there are huge economies of scale in regulation, they are a barrier to entry and therefore to competition. Now, as Tom said, it's very difficult to measure the cost of regulation because much of that cost is in the form of economic activity and innovation, which doesn't take place because of innovation. And you can't know what doesn't happen as a result of regulation. But let me just mention a couple of statistics. And again, it's in this area of land use planning, which Tom and Kate have both mentioned. If you take an acre of farmland, you can probably multiply its value by 100 times by giving permission to build a house or business premises. Now, that's just not some kind of value that's locked up in the farmland. That is a real indication of the economic value foregone as a result of the planning system requiring a piece of land to be used as a farm rather than to provide business or housing services. And I should add, by the way, that biodiversity in farms is far worse, far lower than biodiversity in houses, especially when you build houses with gardens. So the environmental arguments for planning restrictions are rather tenuous as well. Secondly, work from the London School of Economics, Paul Cheshire, showed that the planning restrictions under the town centre first policies of the 1990s knocked 20% off the total factor productivity in the retail sector in the following 20 years. This is a breathtakingly large fall in productivity from one set of regulations. What should we do? Well, we can discuss that in more detail in the Q&A. It's very difficult to change this culture. I think the first thing I would do, and it's a good thing to do now because we'll have a change in, I think, the economic structure following COVID, is to exempt new things from regulation. Maybe put a big label on saying this is not regulated, but at least exempt things from regulation. And I think this is an approach which could be taken in the financial sector in particular. And we found in the 18th and 19th centuries and the early 20th century that when you didn't have state regulation, private sector bodies grew up to regulate financial markets and were actually very effective. Indeed, successive royal commissions found they were rather more effective than the state was in regulating activity. So perhaps if we exempt things from regulation going forward, clearly mark them as exempted, we might get these structures developing within markets to regulate activities such as finance. Let me, but do so in a way which is more conducive to innovation and embraces less a culture of rule writing. Now, let me finish where I began with religion. This is Cardinal Vincent Nichols addressing the British electorate in a letter in 2010, which he wrote before the general election of that year. He said, "In place of virtue, we have seen an expansion of regulation. A society that is held together just by compliance to rules is inherently fragile, open to further abuses, which will be met by a further expansion of regulation. This cannot be enough." And then he went on to write about how we needed a renewal of the virtues to replace this culture of regulation. I think that is true. And I think regulation is making society inherently fragile, but it's deeply embedded in our culture now, not just in terms of regulation coming out of the state, but the whole way in which business operates. And I think turning that tide is going to be very difficult, and it does require a battle at the level of culture, not just at the level of politics.
Thank you very much there, Philip. And one of the things I think we'll come back to there is exactly how you do that, if you wanted to do that battle, especially when you've got trade-offs and many people in the population might not necessarily agree with you. So it's quite a difficult battle you might be running. Luke, why don't you say, have your fair share of time on camera?
Thank you. Well, I will do a little bit. I think I could probably take up at least half an hour of argument with Philip about the idea that no regulation in the mortgage business led to no bank defaults. I think there were regulation, market behavior during the 20th century in the mortgage business was absolutely fine, but there's no doubt in the first 10 years of this century that behavior in the mortgage industry went far too far without regulation, and the regulation in 2011 was a response to the number of bank failures created out of the mortgage business in 2008. So I think we have to be careful to look back and judge everything together, and there has been a history of too many times of business leaders taking a lack of regulation and pushing it too far, so that we end up with something that's a blow up that ends up therefore driving regulators to get involved. But stepping away from that, I guess, as I'm here as an investor, to give a slightly different perspective, I think that one of the problems around growth is created by the fact that we have made the UK almost uninvestable to people outside the UK. The reason is the amount of volatility around decision-making and about regulation as one of the key elements of that, that people have no idea where we're going in terms of regulation. What they hear is one set of people calling for massive increases in regulation, another person calling for getting rid of all regulation. And in order to get investor capital into the UK, which will reduce the cost of doing things, which will is needed, our cost of capital for companies, whether public or private, is much too high in the UK because people don't want to invest here. We need to create confidence for those investors. And in the end, it's about less extreme change. And I would like to see less regulation around a number of things, but I'd like to see it done in a gradual way so that we don't create a thing where we rip out some regulations. It takes 3 years to rip them out, and then we get a change of government and suddenly you get a big swing back the other way. Those are just environments that investors do not like to play in, and that makes providing capital that allows things to move, that creates the opportunity for productivity growth and growth generally that we all want to have. I think that it's very important around our flexibility on our workforce, that is an area where I do think we've seen a reduction we've seen an increase in regulation in the last few years. A lot of that regulation is not direct, it's indirect, but it has the effect of making the workforce significantly less flexible today than it used to be. And I think it's important, if we want to get productivity growth and growth into the economy, that we do things that will get us back towards that flexibility. I think one of the things that I've been rather amazed in the COVID reaction is there's been all this urge to say we must get everybody back into the centre of London, get people back. I get very offended when people say we must get them back to work, but getting them back to the office in central London. I think one of the remarkable things of COVID is it has shown that if you are flexible with employees, actually they can work almost anywhere in most businesses or most thought businesses. The future for growth in economies, ours and others, is about thought businesses, whether that's finance, I believe that's a good business, whether it's technology, whether it's any of the other service industries which are around thought processes, and giving people the ability to work in the place where they feel most comfortable significantly increases their productivity. One of the things we've found is, we employ about 600 technologists working for us. In work from home, the productivity of those people has gone up significantly. Why? Because a lot of the types of personalities that are good at technology are not necessarily good in a big office with lots of people. They like quiet, solitude. They like staring at a screen. They're good at setting up technology. And actually, we have an opportunity to do something really constructive towards leveling up in the economy by letting people work from wherever it is they want to work from. And thereby, you can have somebody live in Yorkshire and Northumberland working for a business in the city. I think the last 6 months has proved its work, and it has worked. And I hope that companies will move in that direction, and that regulation will not lead us to have people sitting in the office in order to prove that we're checking on them, because we check on everybody through some virtual means. We check on everybody's emails. We check on what they're doing on their computer. They don't need to be in the office for us to do that. And that seems to me one of the opportunity areas that people are ignoring in this urge to get back to central London and make sure that Pret-a-Manger's 700,000 stores, or how many they have in London, have enough customers. So with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Luke, and thank you to all the panelists for your introductions and very good thoughts. We've covered many of the topics across the panel. I just wanted to think about a couple of very difficult trade-offs. We all seem to have been talking about things. What two people were talking, Kate and Tom were talking about planning and land use, and so was Philip was as well, with his good example of the price of land depending on the use to which it can be put. Now, this is always very difficult because we know that probably that's the biggest harmful regulation in the UK, which definitively holds back growth. It also is massively more harmful in the southeast of the UK than it is in other parts of the UK. And it also is massively most damaging just where the local population really don't want any changes whatsoever and are most vehemently against any changes in the land use that surrounds them. So it creates this rather difficult trade-off between essentially the economic case and democracy, or what people want. And how should a government, which has to sort of, as it were, arbitrate, whilst also being elected, because we still live in a democracy, between what is maybe good for the country and bad for people who live near them? Kate, why don't you go first?
Easy question, Chris. No pressure at all. Well, I think there are a few things to break down there. The first is genuinely making the case and involving local communities in what you're going to build. So I think the organization YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard, has laid out some really interesting ideas about how you integrate community decisions, and not in a superficial way, but get them involved from the very beginning. One of the major fears that locals have is that what you're going to build in the area is not going to represent the area or integrate with the area in terms of design. And oftentimes when government is centrally planning these things, they do get it completely wrong. So having that sort of organic feedback as to what you visually like to see in the area and what kind of home you'd like to live next to is really quite key. But of course, it's a very difficult trade-off. Many people still aren't going to feel secure if you say to them, well, look, you'll have a bit of a say in what goes up next to you. And this is where you just have to get very honest. Who's going to end up paying, not just for all the COVID spending we just did, which people say is a one-off. I'm not remotely convinced that it is actually, but a lot of it may well be a one-off. But the huge amounts of debt that we were racking up before the COVID crisis, the Office for Budget Responsibility saw this going through the roof in a few decades' time, regardless of what happened with COVID. We have an aging population, as you mentioned, Chris. Any kind of crackdown on immigration, and we've yet to see what the rules in January are actually going to result in terms of how many more young people come to the UK and contribute. But all of these factors would suggest that people in the United Kingdom are going to have to start paying in some way for what they're consuming, whether that be through tax rises or whether that be through cuts to their services. I'm somebody who does think a growth agenda can account for a lot of this, but as we're discussing in this conversation, if you're not willing to make those regulatory changes, you're going to have to go back to austerity or to tax rises. So I think you have to say to these communities, often older, often people who were able to get on the housing ladder when it was much easier to do so. Theresa May tried it with the so-called dementia tax and it didn't work, but at some point, tough decisions are going to have to be made. And if you are a property owner and you've stopped everybody else from getting on the ladder, we're going to be looking at you to contribute more. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, I just wanted to say, I think in some ways it's realistic to suggest that people are going to change their mind just with an telling them they're going to have to pay more at some point, because for them this is a coordination problem. For them that's not true. They definitely lose. Is this the case that government just has to sort of woman up and tell them that sorry, it's for the good of the country and they need to have more people living nearby?
I think it would be helpful for the government to be honest about this and to stop brushing it under the rug. It may well be the case that we go through this the hard way and that people through democratic processes still decide not to change, and that those difficult and painful decisions come in later. But we see that with lots of things. I would argue that the inability to rationally look at the healthcare service in this country and the way that it issues and rations healthcare, and being so wedded to that when the rest of Europe has done something very different, often arguably more progressive and better for their patients, has also resulted in really painful effects that we're experiencing now. So no, I'm not convinced it's going to work, but at some point the switch has to flip. But I'm not saying that will be tomorrow or the next day, Chris. We could be looking at another decade of stagnation. I just hope we're not.
Now, Philip, is it not easy to make the locals happy by taking some part of the uplift in the value of the land, which happens at the point where you agree planning to something, however you agree the planning, you take some part of that and you take that money and you use it to deliver facilities for the local populace, whether it's schools, it's doctors, it's so on and so forth. It seems like the sort of simplest version of easy redistribution that the market could do very effectively that somehow is being ignored.
Well, we already try some of that, don't we, with essentially through regulation, through Section 106 agreements.
But yes, but what we do is to force it onto the house builders who then do everything they can to avoid doing it.
We do, but I'm sure you're right that there are ways that the uplift is clearly the element where you have some lubrication in this sphere. I mean, the second big trade-off, and Philip, I'm going to come to you because you seem to suggest it in some ways wasn't there, and Luke, I think, disagreed with you, was that regulations are generally there for a purpose. They're not generally just put in on a whim or because bureaucrats love to tell other people what to do. And the general purpose is normally that something has gone very badly wrong in the past, which comes with the response of regulations. So the 2011 mortgage regulations were clearly because the mortgage market did actually go very badly wrong in the first 10 years of this century. And nearly all health and safety regulations have come in because been some terrible accident, and we want to learn the lessons from that and therefore not have it again. Look at Grenfell. We are going to get significant regulations from that, and most of those will probably be good because something went horribly wrong with our fire safety regulations in that disaster. So are you I mean, again, I just wanted to think about how you deal with that trade-off, Philip. How do you deal with the trade-off that actually the intent of most regulations are for good and for rectifying something that's gone very badly wrong in a slightly deregulated environment we've had in the point previous to the regulations being imposed?
Okay, sorry, I've just I've got sawing behind me, which I hope the noise doesn't interfere too much. I think you have to deal with some of these problems really by the institutional framework which you set up. So I mean, I would disagree really about the mortgage regulations. So the FSA was given the ability to regulate mortgages in 2004, and then he brought in these regulations in 2011. The financial crisis was much more about actually what went on in the highly regulated United States mortgage market than it was about what went on in the UK mortgage market, which was largely consequential. We can have a debate about that, the magnitude of it, and so on. But what has really changed in the post-war period is a movement from primary legislation, which sets out legislation, sometimes with some detailed regulations in response to a specific problem, which the health and safety regulation from Victorian times is a very good example of, to in the 1980s, which was to some extent arose as a result of the European Union, but also I think Margaret Thatcher's desire to centralise government processes somewhat, where regulatory, or rather frameworks of legislation would be set out and governments would then put detailed regulations before Parliament and they weren't even discussed or voted on, to the late 1990s, which we then started setting up these bodies whose job it was really to write regulation, and they are not in any sense directly accountable to Parliament, even if they are theoretically accountable in the case of the financial regulators to the Treasury. So I think thinking about that framework again and moving back to a position whereby we might deal with the perceived problem through a proper democratic process with legislation put before Parliament, discussed, debated and voted on, rather than setting up bodies that actually simply have an interest in writing more regulation that enhances their power, but also have an interest in being extremely risk averse. So I read the Telegraph on a Saturday. You'd expect the Telegraph to be a paper which is supportive of free markets, but it's constantly excoriating the FCA for not being hard enough on this practice or that practice. And it expects the FCA, and of course the FCA naturally doesn't want bad publicity from ever taking a risk so that something goes wrong on its watch. So I think you just take you just create a culture by our modern means of creating regulation by which it just inevitably grows, and every possible hole, everything that can possibly go wrong is sealed up by a new regulation.
Now, Luke, I wanted to come back to you, particularly on this question of financial regulation. And we also have a question from the audience, which gets, I think, to the nub of it. And I think your experience will be really, really helpful here. So the question from Connor Walsh is the problem of financial regulations a large number of small, ineffective, performative regulations rather than a small number of effective regulations? And I suppose, again, it would be good to get your perspective on the Bank of England, when it took over a lot of the financial regulations, at least at the macro end, in 2012, said it wanted essentially to go back a little bit to the governor's eyebrows, that it wouldn't have small performative regulations, but you would know, boy would you know if you overstep the mark. Is that actually working now, and has that been an effective change compared with the FSA pre-financial crisis?
I think I would say that the part of that which has been most effective is the fact that they introduced something called the senior manager regime within banks, and it's now spreading into the rest of the industry. It's come into asset management this year, which basically puts some personal liability on management to actually control things. And that was how the Bank of England's, the governor's eyebrows used to work, is that it would be bad news for the reputation and whatever of the people running banks. And the FCA lived and still has a tendency to live in a world of as many different lines of code of something where it's possible to stick to all of their regulation and still behave extremely badly. So the senior manager regime, which came out of the Bank of England and is now spreading through the FCA, is, I think, actually a form of what you're looking for, which is stepping back and essentially getting management to take more responsibility for what's going on with them in their firms, and having some downside from it, because as soon as you give people a one-way option, they will take it and they will run it to the absolute maximum. And it's what happened, which led financial industry into a mess more than anything else. You're on mute, Chris.
Sorry, does that then create the problem that Philip was talking about, that managers then create internal regulatory structures because they're at the sharp end of any regulatory sort of compliance, so that they then pass it down the firm?
Well, at the first instance, maybe you could say that, but the reality is managers are in the best place to understand what risks are a sensible one to take, what risks are not a sensible one to take. And the more that people actually do that, they should suffer the consequences if they get it wrong. They should get the rewards if they get it right. I think you end up with more accurate control of the things that need control and more flexibility to provide capital to the places where it's attractive, to push into businesses which are interesting and to exit ones which are not interesting. And that flexibility of movement is what creates the opportunity for productivity growth.
Yes, I think that's a very important point, that actually you want people who have the information closest to them to actually be doing, in some sense, the regulation, rather than people having to find that information first and then maybe not get it right. Tom, I did warn you that I was going to come back to you, just ask you just for what can we do to the tax system? I'm not saying up or down, but just to make it function better.
Yeah, I think that points to a really important aspect of this whole issue, that it isn't always, how much tax are you paying? It's what is your experience of the tax system? How hard is it to comply with? And I think that same principle goes, across the whole regulatory state, actually. A lot of businesses, obviously they prefer to be lightly regulated, but a heavy regulation that's very easy to comply with, and that doesn't cost them enormous amounts of compliance time, that would be okay in many circumstances. So looking at the tax system particularly, I think the first thing we could do is actually pay attention to how difficult is it to comply with the tax system. We have this interesting situation at the moment where you look at things like the business impact target, which is one of the government's ways of tracking regulation and its impact on the commercial sector. And they really exclude tax from that altogether. Well, that's a tax issue. That's not a regulatory issue. Let's not worry about that. Well, I don't think that's right. You need to look at all of the costs you're imposing on businesses and individuals. And now I think it's fair to say, if you look at international comparisons, we do not have one of the most difficult tax codes to comply with. The time it takes businesses to handle their tax affairs. I'm sure it could be less. Actually, there are countries that do it better. But we're not among the worst in the developed world, certainly. But I also think there's a broader point about tax reform here, that so much of the difficulty in the tax system, so much of the confusion comes from the way we make tax policy, which is piecemeal over time of budgets and pre-budget reports, another tax rule here, another tax rule there, often trying to fix minor problems or raise a bit of revenue and what have you, without any kind of overarching strategic approach to the tax system as a whole. And so we have a great body in the Office of Tax Simplification that produces great reports on all this stuff. But I'm not sure I really see that carrying through into policy making. The pension rules are surely a great example of that. The degree of complexity that has been introduced, especially for high earners with their pension contributions, is incredible. And we all know about the weird behavioural effects that's had. No one's sitting down to think coherently about the tax system, what its aims are, what the smoothest way to raise the revenue would be. We'll come up with anything like we've got. But because of the way we make tax policy, often to grab a quick headline at budget time, it causes all sorts of problems. So, ideally, it's been probably since 1988 since we had anyone take a comprehensive look at the tax system and do really serious, thorough reform. I think that's what we need now, with simplification very much in mind.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left, and there's a question here which I think is for everyone. Very, very briefly, please. Which countries get it right on regulation, and very briefly, why? Philip, why don't you go first?
Oh, you're on mute, Philip.
Impossible to answer briefly. I would just say that different countries get this right in different areas of economic life.
I'm going to ask you to pick one.
Okay.
And an example, why, what's good about it?
Okay. Well, I think Germany gets things much better in terms of land use planning. The system is much more localized, and the benefits from development are gained by the local community as well as the costs.
Lovely. Thank you. That's beautifully succinct. Luke?
Well, I think the fact that Philip found it very difficult to pick something and I'm finding it very difficult to pick something tells you that if you wanted to think of one area where you have a chance in the new post-Brexit world to actually get a leading edge on other economies in the world, it would be getting this right, keeping this in some simplified format so that then we make some real progress. If I was trying to pick somewhere, I would have picked Australia until fairly recently on financial markets, where they kept a sort of well away from stirring too much trouble, but they have of late got rather in the opposite direction. So.
And Tom?
Yeah, well, if I can cheat very slightly by using a historical example rather than a current one, but I think it is fascinating. When you look at the history of banking in North America and the enormous instability over many years that they experienced in the United States, financial crisis after financial crisis, really, often in some way coinciding with harvest time and the need for lots of cash. And you compare that with Canada, which had a virtually unregulated banking system really up until probably the 1930s and beyond, where they had no problems whatsoever, where the market was able to function extremely smoothly. And we're not going to get back to anything like that sort of pre-war approach. But I do think it's instructive where, two countries next door to each other with a similar historical, economic, cultural background had very different experiences.
Thank you very much. And we've got just time for a very, very quick canter around the panel again. Kate has unfortunately already had to leave us, which is, if you had one thing you could do to improve the regulation in this country and improve the growth rate, what would it be? I just want a few words from each one. Luke, go first.
So stop the process to produce as much new regulation as possible.
Lovely.
If you gave me one thing, it would be nothing new. Nothing
new. Tom?
I think that's a good one, but I think letting people build.
People build? That's we're in slogan time now. Philip?
Yeah, it's got to be similar. I mean, that just solves so many problems simultaneously, including the problem of poverty too. So, and allowing local communities to engage with developers so that there can be some trade-offs and compensations in cash and kind.
Great. I think that is unfortunately us. That's a wrap from us. The big message here, there is one thing in the UK that would help us improve growth. It is the land use and planning system. And I'm going to now hand it back, say thank you very much to all the panel, to Luke, to Tom, to Philip, and to Kate, who's had to leave early, and hand it back to the CPS.
And we're out. Thank you very much, gents. Have a good weekend.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, everyone.
Hey, Robert.
Bye.